Hello, and welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, if you're new here, this is your home for sweeping romantic stories set in the grandest eras of history. Long stories, deep stories, the kind you settle into like a warm fire on a cold night. If this sounds like your kind of place, hit subscribe right now. You won't regret it. And if you've been here before, welcome back, my darling. I have been waiting to tell you this one. Now, get comfortable, because this story will take everything from you and give it all back tenfold. She was not supposed to be the one he wanted. That was the arrangement. That was the plan. Her sister had the golden hair, the dazzling smile, the figure that made painters weep and poets lose their reason. Her sister had practiced the curtsy for 3 days. Her sister had already chosen the monogram she would embroider on the ducal linen. Clara Voss had done none of those things. She had been too busy making sure there was linen to embroider, counting the household inventory at midnight by candlelight, stretching the last of the butter, quietly selling her mother's pearls one by one so the cook could be paid and her family would not starve before the Duke arrived. She was not supposed to matter in this story. She was the shadow, the useful one, the plain one, the one nobody saw. And yet, when Edmund Calder, the 8th Duke of Ashveil, walked through the door of Hartwell House on a cold November morning, his gray eyes swept the assembled family like a blade and stopped. Not on the golden-haired beauty positioned at the front, not on the weeping mother, nor the sweating father. On Clara, standing half-hidden behind the parlor door, a ledger tucked under her arm, ink still on her fingers, looking as though she had not expected to be seen. He looked at her for 3 full seconds, and something in his expression shifted, the way a locked room shifts when someone finds the key. "You," he said, and that was how it began. Hartwell House had once been beautiful. Clara Voss could still see it, if she looked carefully. The bones of it, the gracious proportions of the main hall, the way the afternoon light fell through the tall windows and gilded the oak floors. She could see what it had been, the way you can sometimes see a beloved face beneath the ravages of illness and time. But that was the past. The present was more brutal. It was the 23rd of November, in the year 1821, and the chimneys at Hartwell smoked badly, because the flues needed relining and there was no money for a sweep. The carpets in the drawing room were threadbare at the center. The portrait of Clara's great-grandmother had been moved 3 times in the last year, each time to cover a new patch of peeling plaster. The silver in the dining room had been quietly replaced, piece by piece, with plated tin, and Clara alone knew this, because Clara had done it herself, selling the real silver to a merchant in the village of Dunmere with instructions never to speak of it. She was 26 years old, and she had been managing the slow, dignified collapse of her family's fortunes for 4 years. It had begun when her father, Sir George Voss, had made 3 catastrophic investments in a single winter: a canal scheme that flooded, a textile venture that burned, and a shipping concern that sank, literally, off the coast of Portugal. The debts that followed were like a rising tide, at first manageable, then alarming, then simply everywhere, soaking through every room, every meal, every silence at the dinner table. Clara had responded the way she responded to every crisis. She had sat down with a ledger and a candle, and she had done the arithmetic. The arithmetic was not encouraging. They had, at their current rate of expenditure, perhaps 18 months before the house itself would have to go. Her father's solution to this information had been to go to bed with a headache and remain there for most of the following week. Her mother's solution had been to weep and then plan a dinner party. Her younger sister Isabel's solution had been to be so beautiful that someone would surely rescue them. As it turned out, Isabel's solution was the one that almost worked. Lord Fenwick, a neighboring baronet, had been deeply interested in Isabel for 2 seasons. He was kind, moderately solvent, and very much in love with her. Clara had quietly encouraged the match. She had arranged for them to be thrown together at every possible opportunity. She had even, on one memorable occasion, engineered a picnic in the rain that had resulted in Isabel needing Lord Fenwick's coat and Lord Fenwick experiencing something that Clara privately classified as his awakening. But Isabel had not married Lord Fenwick. Isabel had decided she could do better. And then, in the spring of 1821, a letter had arrived at Hartwell House. Not from a suitor, not from a creditor, though those came regularly enough, but but from the London offices of a Mr. Bassett, man of business, to His Grace the Duke of Ashveil. The letter was written in the careful, neutral language of a man who had spent a lifetime making extraordinary things sound ordinary. It proposed, in essence, a transaction. The Duke of Ashveil, it explained, was in need of a wife. He was prepared to offer, in exchange for that wife, the complete settlement of the Voss family's outstanding debts, which Mr. Bassett listed, itemized, with a precision that made Clara's stomach turn, because the man had done his research. He knew exactly how bad it was. He knew about the tin silverware. In exchange, a marriage to one of Sir George's daughters of marriageable age. The letter did not specify which daughter. Sir George had read it aloud at breakfast, his hands shaking. Lady Voss had gripped the table. Isabel had sat up very straight, her blue eyes bright, and smiled the smile of a woman who has just been told that destiny has arrived, right on schedule. Clara had said nothing. She had looked at the letter for a long moment, then turned and walked to the window, where she had stared at the frost-killed garden and done more arithmetic. The arithmetic was this. The Duke's offer would save them. It would pay every debt. It would let them keep the house. It would give her father back something that looked like dignity, and her mother back something that looked like peace, and it would take one of them away. Clara had looked at Isabel, radiant, expectant, already mentally redecorating a ducal townhouse, and had felt nothing in particular, which was unusual. She usually felt something. She was not a cold person. She was simply, at that moment, very tired. "We must prepare," Sir George had announced, crumpling the letter in excitement. "He will come to inspect. The letter says he will come in 3 weeks. We must have the house ready. We must have Isabel ready." Nobody had looked at Clara. Nobody ever did. Edmund Calder had not wanted a wife. He wanted, in rough order of priority, the flooding in the Ashveil mine shafts to stop, his lead factor to stop embezzling, his tenants in the north to stop threatening organized protest over the state of the farmhouses, and his younger brother Roland to stop losing money at cards in places that made the newspapers. A wife was not on the list. But Mr. Bassett, who had served 3 Dukes of Ashveil and survived them all, had sat across from Edmund's mahogany desk one morning in September and laid out the situation with the calm of a man delivering a weather report. "The mine repairs will cost £14,000, he had said. "The farmhouse rebuilding program, another 8. Roland's debts, which you will pay because you always pay Roland's debts," here he had allowed himself the ghost of a sigh, "are currently at 6. That is £28,000, your grace, against a reserve of 11. The shortfall. I can do arithmetic, Bassett." "Of course. I simply thought it useful to hear the number spoken aloud." Edmund had said nothing. He had looked out the window at the grey London sky and felt the familiar weight settle over him, the weight that had been there since he was 19 years old, and his father had died, and the solicitor had opened the books, and the numbers inside them had made Edmund feel as though the floor were tilting. He had spent 8 years writing that tilt, 8 years of methodical, grinding work, of selling assets and reducing costs, and working 18-hour days at a desk in a house that his valet kept pointing out he never actually lived in. He was 31 years old, and he felt approximately 60. "There is a route," Bassett had said carefully, "a marriage. A strategic one. Sir George Voss of Dunmere, baronet, heavily indebted, 2 daughters of marriageable age. The younger one is considered a notable beauty by the county. There is, however," Bassett had paused, choosing his words with the care of a man diffusing something. "There is also the matter of the grandmother's inheritance. The elder daughter, a Miss Clara Voss, has a trust from her maternal grandmother, £30,000, locked until her marriage. Her father cannot touch it. Only marriage releases it." Edmund had looked at him for a long moment. "You want me to marry a baronet's daughter from the countryside for her dowry?" "I want you to marry a baronet's daughter from the countryside," Bassett had said, with dignity, "so that 2,000 tenants don't lose their roofs next winter." Edmund had thought about those 2,000 tenants for a long time. Then he had said, "Write the letter." But he was not, as anyone who knew him would confirm, a man who walked blindly into anything. He had made his decision. But he would see for himself what manner of people he was dealing with. He would arrive early. He would be unannounced. He would see the truth of them before they had a chance to dress it up for inspection. He left London on a grey Thursday morning, 4 days before he was expected, dressed in the plain coat of a traveling man, on a horse he'd chosen specifically for not looking ducal. No outriders, no luggage. Just Edmund Calder, riding north, with the cold wind in his face and a grim feeling in his chest about what he was about to do. He had not expected Hartwell House to surprise him. He had expected a certain kind of family, desperate, fawning, ambitious, a father who would say anything, a mother who would flutter, a beautiful daughter who would perform. He got all of those things, but he got something else too, something he had not planned for at all, and it had changed everything. He arrived on a Thursday evening, as the light was failing and a thin sleet had begun to fall. He came around the back of the house as a groom would, identifying himself to a startled stable boy as a man from the Duke's advance party, and asking for his horse to be seen to. The boy, who was about 12 and clearly underfed, took the horse with wide eyes and ran. Edmund looked at the horse, looked at the boy, and added a coin to the one he'd already planned to leave. He spent the first quarter hour simply walking around the perimeter of the house in the sleet, which told him a great deal. The east wing needed pointing. The kitchen garden was bare and carefully tended, every inch of productive soil still in use, which spoke of someone practical in charge. The woodpile was modest but neatly stacked. The house was poor, but it was not chaotic. Someone here was fighting. He found himself near a side entrance when he heard voices from within, a sitting room, he judged, by the light through the low window. He was not, he told himself, eavesdropping. He was simply standing in the sleet near a window. The voices came to him through no fault of his own. "Don't see why I can't wear the blue silk," a voice was saying. Young, melodious, petulant. "It's my best gown, because the blue silk has a tear at the hem that I haven't had time to mend." A different voice. Lower, quieter, steady. "The green muslin is perfectly presentable." "The green muslin is dreadful, and you know it. If the Duke sees me in the green muslin, then he will see you in a gown that fits and that isn't damaged. Isabel." The second voice had a new note in it, not unkind, but firm. "He is not coming to catalog your wardrobe. He is coming to meet the family. He is coming to choose a wife." The first voice, Isabel apparently, said it with the simplicity of someone stating that rain was wet. "And I intend to be chosen. You don't have to worry about any of this, Clara. You're just going to be, there, in the background, helping." A pause. "Yes," said the quiet voice, "Clara," and Edmund noted that she said it without particular bitterness, which was somehow worse than if she had. "I suppose I am." "The guest room," Isabel said, changing tack entirely. "Is it ready? Has Mrs. Hatch done the linens?" "I told her. The guest room is ready. The linens are pressed. The silver in the dining room has been polished." A slight pause. "What silver we still have. And the flowers? I cut them from the kitchen garden this afternoon. They're in the blue vase in the hall." Isabel made a sound of vague approval. "Good. You're so useful, Clara. You really are." And then, with the artlessness of someone who genuinely meant it as a compliment, "I don't know what we'd do without you." Edmund stood in the sleet and listened to the silence that followed. He did not hear Clara's response, if she gave one. The voices moved away into the interior of the house. He remained where he was for a moment, the sleet pattering against his coat. Useful. He thought about that word for a longer time than was reasonable. Then he moved along the side of the house, toward the sound of what he now identified as someone crying, quietly, privately, in the way of someone who had learned to cry without making a scene. He found her through a gap in the yew hedge, a woman sitting on a stone bench in what had once been a formal garden, now a little wild, a little overgrown, with the remnants of a rose bower above her. She was not, he noted, conventionally beautiful. She was interesting. Her hair was dark, pulled back plainly, with several pieces having escaped into the damp evening air. Her gown was simple gray wool. Her hands, and he could see her hands because she was not wearing gloves, which told him she had come out here without planning to, were folded in her lap, and one of them held a small, leather-bound book, pressed flat against her knee as if she'd been reading and had simply stopped. She was not crying with any drama. She was simply sitting with tears on her face, looking at the dead roses and not doing anything about the tears, as though she had simply run out of the energy to wipe them away. He should have left. He knew he should have left. He was trespassing on something private, something that was not meant for him. But he did not leave. He stood in the shadows of the yew, and he looked at this woman who had been described to him in Bassett's report as the elder daughter Clara Voss, 26, plain in appearance, known locally for competence in household management, and he thought that Bassett, thorough as he was, had rather missed the point. After a long moment, she lifted the book, found her page, and began to read again. In the sleet, on a cold stone bench, alone. Edmund Calder walked back to the inn in the village and sat for 2 hours in front of a fire, staring into it. He had come to choose a wife. He had not expected to feel that the choice had already been made for him. Clara had been awake since 5. She had dressed herself. She always dressed herself now, since the lady's maid had been let go 8 months ago, in her second-best gown, a soft dove gray that her mother called gloomy, and Isabel called invisible, and Clara considered simply clean and well-fitted. She had pinned her hair with more care than usual, not because she expected the Duke to look at her, but because one ought to look one's best when there was a Duke in the house. It was a matter of principle. She had then spent 3 hours ensuring that every other thing in Hartwell House looked its best. The flowers in the hall, garden chrysanthemums, the last of the season, arranged in the blue vase with the small chip on the base that Clara always turned to face the wall. The dining room laid for a luncheon that Mrs. Hatch had been planning for 2 days, stretching the household budget in ways that made Clara slightly nauseous. The fires lit in all the principal rooms, which meant they would be freezing by evening, but there was no help for it. The green baize cloth on the hall table, which hid the stain from the time Sir George had dropped a decanter. Isabel came down at 10, magnificent in the blue silk, which Clara had risen at 4 in the morning to mend. She had not mentioned this. "You look well," Clara said. Isabel turned, the silk catching the light. "I look wonderful," she said, without conceit. It was simply true, and she knew it. "Do you think he'll be handsome?" "I have no idea. They say he's terrifying." Isabel tilted her head, examining herself in the hall mirror, cold and silent, like a statue, but very rich. "His finances are complicated," Clara said carefully, because she had read everything she could find about the Duke of Ashveil in the past 3 weeks, and complicated was the accurate word. Clara. Isabel turned from the mirror and looked at her sister. Really looked at her, which was unusual. "Are you all right? You look tired." "I'm fine." "You're always fine." Isabel's expression flickered with something almost like guilt. Then it was gone. "Come and stand in the parlor. You should be there when he arrives. For, you know, appearances." Appearances. Right. The Duke of Ashveil arrived at 11, not noon, as his letter had specified. Clara was in the hall with her arms full of freshly folded linens she'd been taking upstairs when the sound of a carriage reached her. She froze. There was no time. There was no question of setting down the linens gracefully and arranging herself artfully. She simply pressed back against the wall near the parlor door as Thomas, their elderly butler, shuffled to the entrance with as much dignity as he could muster. She heard the door open. Cold air rushed in. She heard footsteps, measured, unhurried. She heard her father's voice. "Your Grace, welcome, welcome to Hartwell. We are deeply, most deeply," and then she heard nothing, because she had stopped listening, because the man who had just walked into the hall of her family home was not what she had expected. He was tall. That she had expected, dukes were usually tall in the imagination, but the quality of his tallness was different from what she'd imagined. He was not tall like a statue, as Isabel had suggested. He was tall like a tree that had grown in harsh conditions, strongly, a little asymmetrically, with a sense of roots going very deep. He wore black, very plain, very fine. His face was angular and unsmiling, with a jaw that looked as though it had been set in opposition to something for a very long time. His hair was dark. His eyes swept the hall. They passed over her father, over her mother, over Isabel, and Clara watched them pause on Isabel, taking in the golden hair and the blue silk and the perfect smile, and she thought, "There, that's done, that's the choice made." And then his eyes moved past Isabel, and found her. Clara, standing against the wall with her arms full of folded linen and ink, still on her right forefinger from the accounts she'd been doing at midnight, wearing a gray dress that her sister called invisible. He looked at her for 3 seconds. She counted. She did not know why she counted. And then his expression did something she could not name. It was not a smile, it was not recognition exactly. because they had never met. It was more like arrival. The look of someone who has been traveling a long distance and has just seen, on the horizon, the thing they were traveling toward. It lasted 3 seconds. Then his gaze moved away, and he was attending to her father, all cool formality and measured courtesy. Clara let out a breath she had not known she was holding, and slipped through the parlor door to deposit the linens. Her hands, she noticed, were not quite steady. Luncheon was an exercise in careful theater. Clara had arranged herself at the far end of the table. The Duke was at the head, her father at his right. Isabel positioned with strategic precision at the Duke's left, radiant and charming, and performing with considerable skill the role of a woman who was perfectly at ease with the situation. She was not at ease, Clara knew. Isabel was never entirely at ease, but she performed ease beautifully, which amounted to the same thing. The Duke was difficult to read. He answered questions with brevity. He asked a few of his own, about the estate, about the surrounding farmland, about the state of the roads in winter. He was not, Clara observed from her post at the far end of the table, cold exactly. He was contained. He was a man holding himself very still, the way you hold still when you are listening very carefully. He was listening. To everything. He looked at her twice during luncheon, which she counted as an anomaly, and tried to dismiss. The second time their eyes met, she was passing the bread, which was her own damson and walnut loaf that Mrs. Hatch had placed on the table without mentioning who had baked it at 6 that morning. He held her gaze for half a second longer than was strictly necessary, and something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. Clara looked at the table. After luncheon, Sir George proposed that they repair to the drawing room, where Isabel had prepared a short piece on the pianoforte. The Duke inclined his head in polite assent. They processed from the dining room. In the slight confusion of doorways and the movement of chairs, Clara found herself standing near the Duke, closer than she had been all meal, close enough to note the quality of his coat and the particular shade of his eyes, which were a stormy, unsettled gray, like a sky before serious weather. "You baked the bread," he said. It was not a question. She looked at him sharply. Yes, it was very good." He said it plainly, with the air of a man who was accustomed to saying only things he meant. The walnut was well balanced. Clara opened her mouth to say something modest and dismissive, something about Mrs. Hatch or the recipe or the kitchen, and found, to her own slight surprise, that she did not. "Thank you," she said instead. "I've been making it since I was 14. My grandmother taught me." He nodded. "Your grandmother. She was a practical woman. She believed a person ought to be able to feed themselves and their household regardless of circumstance." Clara paused. She was rather ahead of her time. Something shifted in his expression. "She sounds formidable." "She was magnificent," Clara said simply, and then became aware that she was standing in her own hallway having a conversation with a Duke about bread and her dead grandmother, and that this was not normal. "I beg your pardon. I should— Miss Voss." She stopped, turned. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she couldn't name. "After the music," he said, "I would like to speak with your father." A pause. "With you present, if you're willing." Clara stared at him. "With me?" "With you. May I ask?" "I'll explain everything then." His eyes held hers for one more moment. "I would like to explain everything." He walked into the drawing room. Clara stood in the hall for a count of 5 and then followed. Isabel played beautifully. She always did. The Mozart piece was light and precise, her fingers moving with easy confidence, her profile lit by the winter light in a way that was almost absurdly picturesque. The Duke sat and watched, and gave no indication of what he was thinking. Clara sat in her usual place, against the side wall, slightly out of the main circle, available to ring for tea, or stir the fire, or slip out quietly if someone needed something, which they usually did. When the music ended, Isabel turned on the bench with a smile that she'd been practicing. Clara knew, in front of the mirror for several days. The Duke inclined his head. "You play very well, Miss Voss." Isabel's smile widened. "You are too kind, Your Grace." He turned to Sir George. "Sir George, I would like, if I may, a private word." "I would ask that," and here his gaze moved, deliberately, across the room, and landed on Clara. "Your elder daughter be present." The room went very quiet. Isabel's smile froze. Lady Voss made a small sound. Sir George said, with the confusion of a man who had been expecting something else entirely, Clara? If she's willing, the Duke said. Clara found everyone looking at her. It was a deeply unfamiliar sensation. She put down the mending she'd been quietly attending to in her corner, and had Isabel's eyes not been so fixed and furious, Clara might have been embarrassed by it, and said, yes. Of course. They sat in the smaller study, the three of them, Sir George behind his desk, Clara in the chair to the side, the Duke standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the frost-killed garden that Clara had looked at so many times herself. He turned. I'll be direct, he said. I find it wastes less time. Sir George said, Of course, of course. The Duke spoke over him, gently but absolutely. My situation is this, and he laid it out, not the sanitized version Clara imagined he'd been planning to deliver, but something closer to the truth. The estate, the costs, the specific problems, the need for liquidity. He was precise and he was honest, and Clara found herself listening with the part of her mind that was always doing arithmetic, and the numbers he described were real numbers, not performance numbers, and she understood them. When he finished, Sir George was nodding with the eager relief of a man who has just been handed a rope. The contract, the Duke said, calls for a marriage to one of your daughters. He paused. I have decided which one. Sir George opened his mouth. He was, Clara knew, about to say Isabel. The Duke said, I would like to formally propose to Miss Clara Voss. The silence that followed was of a type Clara had not experienced before. It was the silence of a room that has just been struck by lightning and has not yet decided what to do about it. Sir George's mouth remained open. Clara sat very still. Your Grace, her father said at last, in the tone of a man reassembling himself. Clara she is certainly, but my younger daughter is very beautiful, the Duke said calmly. Yes, I noticed. He looked at Clara, not at her father, at her. I also noticed other things, Clara said, in a voice that was impressively steady given the circumstances. May I ask why? You may. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall. Clara could see it through the window behind him, small flakes drifting against the gray sky. Because, he said, you are the person in this house who is holding everything together. Because you baked bread at 6 in the morning, so there would be something on the luncheon table worth eating. Because your father's ledgers, which I can see from here, have been recently re-indexed, in 2 different hands, with marginal notations in yours. Tell me that someone in this house understands what the situation actually is and is dealing with it. Because you mended your sister's dress so she could wear it today. He paused. And because, he added, more quietly, I watched you last night, sitting in the snow in the garden, reading a book and crying very quietly so as not to be a bother to anyone, and I thought that was about the loneliest thing I had ever seen. Clara felt the blood leave her face. You were in the garden, she said. I arrived a day early. He did not look remotely apologetic. I wanted to see the truth of things. And the truth of things, she said carefully, led you to this. The truth of things, he said, led me to you, Miss Voss. I would like to know if you're willing. Clara looked at her father, who was gaping. She looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap in the habitual posture of a woman who has spent years trying to take up as little space as possible. She looked at Edmund Calder, 8th Duke of Ashveil, standing in her father's shabby study with snow falling behind him, looking at her as though she were the only person in the room. She took a breath. I'm willing, she said. Oh, this is only the beginning, isn't it? If you're feeling it, if your heart is already doing something, tap the like button. It takes 1 second, and it means the world to this channel. Keep listening. It gets so much better. They were married 12 days later, in the small stone church in Dunmere, in a ceremony that lasted 30 minutes and was attended by both families and approximately half the village, who came not because they were invited, but because a duke getting married was the most interesting thing to happen in Dunmere in 20 years. Isabel did not attend. She had taken to her room the afternoon of the duke's proposal and had remained there for 4 days, alternating between fury and misery in proportions that shifted hour to hour. When she finally emerged, pale and glittering with a dangerous kind of calm, she had said to Clara, I forgive you. Clara had not known what to do with that. I hope you'll be happy, she had said, which was true. Isabel had looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that Clara could not read, and then walked away. The wedding dress was not white. Clara had specified cream, and the modiste sent from the city had produced a gown of heavy silk that fell in clean, graceful lines, with long sleeves and a high neck and very little ornamentation, because Clara had asked for very little. When she had put it on the morning of the wedding, she had looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. She looked like herself, only in silk. She had decided that was enough. Edmund had looked at her when she walked down the aisle. He was standing alone at the front of the church, very still, very upright in dark blue, which was the most color she had seen on him, and something had moved across his face. She couldn't name it. She was beginning to think that she might need years to build a vocabulary for Edmund Calder's expressions. He said his vows in a low voice that vibrated in the stone walls of the church. She said hers in a voice she willed to be steady, and mostly succeeded. When he slid the gold ring onto her finger, his hands were cool and very certain. She was, when she walked back down the aisle, the Duchess of Ashveil. It felt entirely unreal. Ashveil Castle was 6 hours north. Clara had prepared herself for austere, for cold and formal and forbidding. She had braced, on the long carriage ride, for something like what she imagined a ducal seat to be, all grandeur and chill, a place that housed a legacy and collected dust. Ashveil was worse than she'd imagined, and nothing like she'd imagined. It was older than she'd expected, medieval at its core, added to in every subsequent century, so that it was a kind of architectural argument between several different eras of ambitious builders. It sat on a rise above a river valley, dark stone against a pale winter sky, and as the carriage came up the long drive through bare branch trees, Clara felt the scale of it settle over her like something physical. It was enormous. It was cold, and she could see it even through the carriage window, even at dusk in November, subtly, pervasively neglected. Not filthy, not abandoned, but unloved. The kind of neglect that comes from practicality rather than carelessness. Every resource directed toward function, nothing left for warmth or beauty or the small refinements that make a house a home. A staff of 8 lined up in the entrance hall, where their breath made small clouds in the cold air. The housekeeper was a tall, spare woman named Mrs. Dunmore, with sharp eyes behind wire spectacles and the demeanor of someone who had kept the castle running through sheer force of will and expected to be told what to do. "Your Grace," she said to Edmund, and then, with a fractional pause that contained multitudes, "Your Grace," to Clara. Clara smiled at her with complete sincerity. "Mrs. Dunmore, I am very glad to meet you. I hope we will be great allies." Mrs. Dunmore blinked. Whatever she had expected the new Duchess to say, it had not been that. Yes, Your Grace," she said, and something in her expression shifted infinitesimally toward thaw. Dinner was a trial. The dining table was vast and uncommunicative, and Clara and Edmund sat at opposite ends of it like 2 points on a map that had not yet been connected by any road. The food was competent and flavorless. The candles, there were many of them, silver sticks ranged down the center of the table, cast more shadow than light. They spoke about the journey, about the weather, about a bridge near the South Gatehouse that apparently needed attention. They did not speak about any of the things that were actually happening. Afterward, Mrs. Dunmore showed Clara to her rooms, a suite connected by a closed door to an adjacent suite that presumably housed her husband. The bedroom had a canopied bed, an enormous fireplace currently doing its best, and curtains of dark blue velvet that puddled on the floor in a way that should have been luxurious but merely felt heavy. Clara sat on the edge of the bed in her wedding clothes and listened to the castle be silent around her. She was a duchess. She was alone. She was in a castle in the north in November with a man she had spoken to perhaps 50 times and married for money. She had made sensible decisions all her life. She had kept her family afloat through grit and cleverness and the careful suppression of her own desires for so long that she had forgotten what her own desires even were. She wondered, briefly and thoroughly, if she had made a catastrophic mistake. Then she got up, found her traveling case, and put on a practical nightgown. In the morning, she would begin. She began with the kitchens. This caused something close to a scandal in the servants' hall because duchesses did not go to the kitchens. They were not supposed to know where the kitchens were, much less appear in them at 7:30 on a Wednesday morning and ask Mrs. Dunmore to show them the larder. Mrs. Dunmore had shown her the larder. and the still room, and the pantry, and the cold cellar, and the linen room, and the laundry. Clara had asked intelligent questions and taken mental notes and thanked everyone by name. She had memorized all 8 names on the first night, which Edmund's valet, a quiet man named Holt, privately described to the boot boy as unnerving. She found the library on the 3rd day. It was 2 stories, with a gallery running around the upper level, and thousands of volumes, many of them clearly unread in decades. The curtains were heavy and dark. The furniture was draped in Holland covers. A thick, settled quiet clung to everything, the quiet of a room that has been holding its breath. Clara stood in the center of it and looked up at the gallery and felt something happen in her chest. Something that might have been, if she had allowed herself to name it, delight. She began to work. She was not reckless about it. She was methodical. She pulled covers from chairs one at a time. She cataloged shelves. She opened curtains on days when the sun came out, which in November were few but precious. She found a particular chair by the east-facing window where the light fell perfectly on winter afternoons, and she moved it there and put a small table beside it, and in the evenings she sat in it and read with a cup of tea and felt, for the first time since her wedding, something approaching peace. Edmund noticed. He did not say much about it. He rarely said much about anything, but she noticed him noticing. She would catch him standing in doorways that she'd just passed through, or see him pause in the hall in front of the vase of winter greenery she'd placed on the side table. Once, she came back to the library to find that a particularly heavy volume she'd been struggling to reach on the upper gallery had been brought down and left with no note on her reading table. Small things. But she cataloged them the way she cataloged the shelves, carefully, without yet knowing what they meant. 2 weeks after the wedding, she found him in his study at 9 o'clock at night, surrounded by papers, and looking like a man who had been fighting a battle that no one else could see. "You should sleep," she said from the doorway. He looked up. In the candlelight, the shadows under his eyes were pronounced. "There are things that need attention." "There are always things that need attention," Clara said, which was true for both of them. "May I look?" A pause. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She came in and sat in the chair across from his desk. "May I look?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned the papers around. Clara looked at the papers. They were the estate accounts. Detailed, accurate, and deeply uncomfortable reading. She had, in the past 2 weeks, been doing her own quiet assessment of Ashveil's finances, collating what she'd been able to glean from conversations with Mrs. Dunmore and the estate steward. The papers on Edmund's desk confirmed most of what she'd suspected. They looked at the numbers together in silence for a while. "The mine," she said. "The mine," he agreed. "The flooding problem. Is it continuous or seasonal?" He blinked. "Seasonal. Primarily winter and spring. And the current pump system dates from my grandfather's time." He was watching her now with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one where he was reassessing something. "There's a drainage survey from 1698, she said. "I found it in the library, 3rd shelf from the left on the upper gallery, bundled with some other estate papers. I haven't read all of it yet, but the section I did read described an older drainage channel running along the eastern side of the valley. It was apparently dug in the 16th century and fell out of use when the mines were opened." She paused. "I may be wrong. I'm not an engineer. But it seemed worth knowing about." Edmund was very still. "You found a drainage survey in the library," he said. "The library contains 40 years of unread estate papers," she said. "I've been cataloging it. I keep finding things." He stared at her. And then, slowly, something happened to his face. It was not quite the expression she'd expected. It was not gratitude, exactly, or surprise, exactly. It was something rawer than both. "Clara," he said. She had not yet gotten used to her name in his voice. He said it very carefully, she'd noticed, as if it were something he was learning. "I should have told you," he said. "From the beginning," he stopped, started again. "This marriage was a transaction. I know that. I arranged it as a transaction, and I knew exactly what I was doing, and I know that must have been difficult to—" "It was also my choice," she said. "I chose it. I know, but I didn't tell you everything I knew. I came to Hartwell early. I watched your family before you knew I was there." He met her eyes. "I watched you." Clara felt something move through her chest. Not quite cold, not quite warm. I know, she said. You told me. In my father's study. You told me about the garden. I saw more than the garden. He looked at the fire. I heard your sister tell you that you were useful. I heard her tell you that you would come and live with her as her companion once she was a duchess. I heard you say nothing at all to that. He paused. I watched you hold yourself very still and not break, and I thought you were the strongest person I had ever seen, and the most invisible. Clara did not trust herself to speak. I chose you, he said, quietly and directly, like everything else he said, because I didn't want you to be invisible anymore. The fire popped. Outside, sleet ticked against the windows. That is, Clara said, when she could speak, quite possibly the most unusual reason for a marriage proposal in the history of this country. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. I suspect you're right. It is also, she said, looking at her hands, the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me. The silence that followed was different from the other silences they had shared. It was not empty. It was full, too full, almost, like a vessel that has just been filled past what it was built to hold. The drainage survey, Edmund said at last, in a voice that was slightly less steady than usual. Show me. They sat in the library until past midnight. The survey unrolled on the reading table between them, talking about water drainage and mine shafts and the particular topography of the Ashveil Valley. It was not, on the surface, romantic. It was practical and technical, and involved a great deal of pointing at squiggles on an old map. But Edmund's shoulder was pressed against hers over the table, and twice she reached across him for a magnifying glass, and his hand brushed hers, and neither of them mentioned it. And at some point she had begun to call him Edmund, naturally, without thinking about it, and he had smiled. A real smile. She saw it. She catalogued it, and said her name back to her in a voice that made the word feel new. She walked back to her rooms at midnight with the feeling that something had shifted on its axis. She did not sleep for quite a long time. Are you still with me? I hope you are. Tell me in the comments, who did you think he would choose? And did you see this coming? I read every single comment. Everyone, let's talk. The London season was Edmund's idea, or rather, it was a necessity that Edmund presented with the reluctant honesty of a man who had learned that Clara could tell the difference. We have to be seen, he said, one morning in early January, looking at a letter from his solicitor. The world knows that I married. The world does not know, the world must not know how close things are. Appearances, Clara said. Appearances, he confirmed, and looked at her with an expression that acknowledged, quietly, the shared absurdity of their situation. Their townhouse in Belgrave Square was grand and cold and had clearly not been opened in 3 years. Clara arrived 3 days before Edmund to manage the opening of it, armed with Mrs. Dunmore and a sense of purpose that the housekeeper had, by this point, learned to interpret as both efficient and unstoppable. By the time Edmund arrived, the house was warm, and the windows were clean, and there were flowers, forced paper whites, at some expense but worth it, in the principal rooms, and cook had produced a soup that actually had flavor, which Edmund ate 2 bowls of and commented on, which cook described to the kitchen maid as the greatest triumph of her professional life. They entered society together. Clara had no illusions about what that meant. She had heard the whispers before they had even arrived in London. Word travels fast in the interconnected world of English aristocracy, and the news that the reclusive Duke of Ashveil had married a baronet's plain elder daughter over her beautiful younger sister had been discussed in every drawing room and dining club in the city. She knew what they would say. She had steeled herself for it. What she had not quite steeled herself for was Edmund. At every ball, every supper, every morning call, he was there. Not in a hovering way, not in a protective way that implied she needed protection. In a present way. He stood with her. He introduced her. He listened when she spoke and deferred to her opinion, and once, at a particularly tedious musical evening, caught her eye across the room during a truly extraordinary performance of the Battle of Prague, and gave her a look of such precise, shared suffering that she had to press her fan against her mouth to suppress a laugh that would have been extremely inappropriate. She had not known, before Edmund, that she could laugh in the middle of a musical evening. She had not known that he had that capacity in him either, to tell the truth. He was learning it at the same time she was. She could watch him discover it, one small increment at a time, a lifted eyebrow, a dry word, once a smile so quick and genuine that it was gone before most people in the room had time to see it. But she saw it. She always saw it. She was, she thought, becoming fluent in him. Society watched them with the avid interest of people watching an unexpected story unfold. The consensus shifted, slowly. The Duchess of Ashveil was not glamorous. She was not dazzling. But she was, there was no other word for it, sure of herself, in a way that was quietly magnetic. She did not try to impress anyone. She was simply, entirely, herself. And there was something about that, in a world of performances and calculations, that drew people in. Lady Cavendish, a formidable senior figure in the ton, cornered Clara at a Venetian breakfast in February and interrogated her for 20 minutes about the management of a large estate, and then announced to her companion, loudly enough for 6 people to hear, that the new Duchess of Ashveil was exactly what that family has needed for a generation. Edmund had been standing 5 feet away. He had heard. He had looked at Clara over Lady Cavendish's hat with an expression that she catalogued under a new heading, one that she had only recently added to her collection, and that she called, privately, pride. Not pride in himself, pride in her. It was new. It was astonishing. She was still getting used to it. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon, announced by a card that gave no warning of the visit's actual purpose. Clara had not seen her sister since the wedding. They had exchanged letters, formally, carefully, in the way of people navigating a new and uncertain terrain. Isabel had been pleasant in her letters, slightly remote. She had not mentioned the Duke's choice or her own reaction to it. She had written about the local assemblies at Dunmere and the new dress she was having made, and whether Clara thought she should try Bath in the spring. Clara had answered in kind, with the automatic courtesy of someone who has learned that some things are better left unexamined for now. But Isabel did not come to the London townhouse for courtesy. Clara knew this the moment she walked into the drawing room and saw her sister standing in the center of it, beautiful as ever, in a gown of deep rose silk, with an expression that Clara recognized from their childhood, the one Isabel wore when she had made a decision and intended to see it through. "Clara," she said. "Isabel." Clara sat down calmly, gestured to the chair opposite. "You look well." "I want to explain myself," Isabel said, without sitting. I have been thinking about what to say to you since November, and I have decided I should simply say it." She paused. "I behaved abominably." Clara waited. "I spent years treating you as furniture," Isabel said, with the painful precision of someone who has rehearsed honesty and found it harder than expected. "As useful furniture. I let you do everything, for our family, and I never said thank you, and when the one extraordinary thing happened, when the one extraordinary man appeared and chose you instead of me." She stopped. I was furious with you." "I know," Clara said. "I shouldn't have been. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't even something you did. You didn't ask for it. He saw you." Isabel's voice was tight. "I have spent my whole life being looked at, and not one man has ever looked at me the way that man looked at you in that hallway. And I didn't even know what that was until I saw it." She sat down abruptly, as though her legs had given the decision without consulting her. "I'm sorry, Clara. I am genuinely sorry." Clara looked at her sister for a long moment. "Sit down properly," she said. "I'll ring for tea." "I am sitting—" "You're perching. Sit properly." Clara rang the bell, and when it was answered, ordered tea and the walnut bread that cook had learned to make, and that Edmund ate 3 slices of every morning. Then she looked at Isabel. "I forgave you months ago," she said. "I should have told you that in a letter, but I didn't know how to say it. I forgave you because I understand you, and because— Isabel, I know what it is to want something very much and have it taken away. I have felt that many times, about many things. I am not unfamiliar with the experience." Isabel looked at her. "What did you want? That was taken away?" Clara considered this. It was a more honest question than Isabel usually asked. "When I was 22, she said, I wanted to study. There were schools, small ones, unconventional ones, that were beginning to admit women. I had read about them. I had written, very secretly, to inquire." She looked at her hands. "And then Papa's investments failed, and that was clearly out of the question. And I let it go. Because someone had to." Isabel was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know that." "No," Do you regret what you chose instead? Clara thought about this carefully, which was how she thought about everything. She thought about Edmund in the library at midnight, his shoulder against hers. She thought about the expression on his face when she had shown him the drainage survey. She thought about the look he had given her across a drawing room full of people, the look she had started to catalog in a new section of her memory, under a heading she had not yet decided how to name. No, she said, I don't. Isabel looked at her for a long moment. He loves you, you know, she said quietly. It's rather obvious. Clara felt warmth move through her, sudden and startling. I don't think we haven't, Clara. Isabel raised an eyebrow. I may have spent years being treated like a decoration, but I am not blind. The man looks at you like you're the solution to every problem he's ever had. The tea arrived. Clara poured it, and her hands were not entirely steady. The Duke of Cranmere's annual winter ball was the most important event of the London season. Had been, for 30 years, the evening on which alliances were cemented and reputations confirmed. The evening everyone in society attended, and at which everyone was observed. Edmund had, in previous years, declined to attend. This year, he escorted his wife through the entrance of Cranmere House on a cold January evening, and the assembled company turned, almost as one, to look. Clara had a new gown. Edmund had arranged it. She had come home one afternoon to find a box from a modiste she hadn't heard of, and inside it a gown of deep midnight blue velvet, cut simply but exquisitely, with long sleeves and a low neckline, and nothing excessive about it. It was, she understood immediately, chosen by someone who knew her. Not the gown a man might imagine for a woman he wanted to look beautiful. The gown a man might choose for a woman he had been paying attention to. She had put it on and stood in front of the mirror and thought, oh. Edmund had been waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He had looked up when she came down, and for 3 full seconds he had simply looked at her, in a way that made her feel as though the world had gone very slightly tilted. You are, he said carefully, remarkable. It's a lovely gown, she said, deflecting. I wasn't talking about the gown. They arrived at Cranmere House. They were announced. The room watched. Clara held Edmund's arm and looked back at the room, not with defiance or with anxiety, but with the calm of a woman who has decided that she is exactly where she is supposed to be. They danced. She had not known, until that moment, that Edmund danced. She had assumed, from his general demeanor, that dancing was something he considered an extravagance, like curtain liners or decorative soaps. But he led her onto the floor for the waltz with complete assurance, and when his hand settled at her waist and his other hand took hers, and they began to move together, she discovered that Edmund Calder danced the way he did everything else, with total precision and commitment and without any wasted motion at all. He also danced, she discovered, in a way that made it feel as though the other 200 people in the room had been moved to a very great distance. Are you comfortable? He said quietly, near her ear, as they navigated a corner. She paused. Happy was the word. She realized with some surprise, simply happy. Yes, she said, very. She felt him smile against her hair, and that was the moment when the evening changed. She felt it before she saw it. A shift in the quality of the room's attention, a redirection of eyes. She turned her head slightly and saw, through the crowd, a figure in rose-pink silk, standing near the doorway with 2 other women, watching the dance floor. Isabel. She had come to the ball. Of course she had. They had parted on good terms in the drawing room, and Isabel was still Isabel. Of course she would come to the most important ball of the season. Clara met her sister's eyes across the room. Isabel lifted her chin slightly. It was not a hostile gesture. It was almost defiant, but not at Clara. Defiant at something else, something in herself. Clara smiled at her. Isabel, after a moment, smiled back. Edmund had been watching this exchange. Your sister? He said. Yes. How are things between you? Better, Clara said. I think genuinely better. She paused. She came to see me last week. She apologized. Did she mean it? Clara considered this as they turned through another corner of the dance. Yes, she said finally. I think she is learning to mean things. It's harder for her than for most people, but she's trying. She looked up at him. People can change. Yes, he said, and something in his voice was different. They can. The music slowed toward its end. Edmund guided her into the final turn, and as the last note sounded, he did not immediately release her. 1 beat, 2 beats longer than the dance required, his hand warm at her waist, her hand in his, both of them standing in the center of the emptying floor. "Clara," he said. "Edmund." He looked at her as though he were about to say something that had been building for a long time. The candlelight caught the gray of his eyes and made them warm for once. Warm and full of something she had been cataloging for months without daring to name it. "I need to tell you something," he said. "You can tell me anything." "I know." He said it with complete simplicity. That is the thing, actually. That is the thing I have been realizing." He glanced at their hands, still joined, as though surprised to find them so. "I have been alone for a very long time. I managed that. I became good at it. I stopped expecting anything from anyone that wasn't a transaction." He looked back at her. "And then you came into my castle and opened all the curtains and found a drainage survey in the library and brought me tea at 9 at night and said the servants are not your wife. And He stopped. Started again. "I don't know exactly when it happened." "When what happened?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "When I fell in love with you," he said. "But I know that it has happened, and I know it is not a thing I am managing or calculating. I know because I don't want to manage it. He made a small gesture that was entirely unlike his usual controlled precision. "I wanted you to know." Clara looked at him. Outside the ballroom windows, she knew it was snowing. She could not see it, but she felt it, the particular quality of the silence that comes when snow is falling. A quieting of the world. "I fell in love with you in the study," she said, "when you told me I was the loneliest thing you'd ever seen, because no one had ever—" She stopped. No one had ever been paying attention. He lifted her hand. He kissed it, once, his eyes on hers. "I am always paying attention," he said, "to you, from now on." Around them, the ballroom had continued, music beginning again, couples reforming, the great engine of the seasons spinning on. But in the small circle of space where they stood, it was just the two of them. "Dance with me again," she said. He smiled. The real one, the unguarded one that reached his eyes and transformed his face, and led her back onto the floor. The letter from the mine surveyor arrived on a Tuesday in July, and Clara read it in the library, in her chair by the east window, with the summer light falling warm across the page. The Ashveil mine drainage project, based on the 16th century channel described in the 1698 survey, re-engineered by a Mr. Aldous Pembridge at a cost that was, as Clara had projected, a fraction of the alternative, was working. The seasonal flooding had stopped. The mine was producing at levels it hadn't seen in 20 years. The men were being paid on time, and the farmhouses were being rebuilt, and 2,000 tenants had roofs over their heads. Clara put the letter down and looked out at the summer garden. It was not the garden she had inherited. That had been a November ruin of dead stems and frost-killed earth. This was what it became when you gave it time and care and attention. Roses in 5 colors along the south wall, a kitchen garden that was the most productive in the county, a small orchard of pear trees that Edmund had planted in March with his own hands, on a Saturday afternoon when no one needed anything from either of them. She heard footsteps on the gallery stairs, the light, quick kind that she would know anywhere now. Edmund came in from the upper gallery, a book in his hand, looking slightly rumpled in a way that she found entirely charming, and had never told him so, because it would be kind of her to let him believe he was still intimidating. He was not very intimidating to her anymore. He was simply hers. "The surveyor's report," she said, holding it up. He took it. Read it. His expression. She watched it, this being one of her great pleasures, moved from neutral to careful, to something that was, in Edmund, the equivalent of another man's loud exclamation. "It's working," he said. "It's working," she confirmed. He put the report down and looked at her with the expression she had finally found a name for, after 8 months of marriage and cataloging. It was not a complicated name. It was just home. He looked at her like she was home. "We should celebrate," he said. "We should. The library is cool in summer." "It is. And I believe there is walnut bread in the kitchen." Clara laughed. "A full one, unguarded. You and the walnut bread. You made it. I'm extremely fond of things you make." He sat on the arm of her chair, which was not orthodox, but which neither of them had ever been particular about orthodoxy. "You know what else I'm fond of?" "Tell me." "This." He touched the side of her face with the back of his fingers, gently, the way you touch something you are making sure is real. Just this, all of it. He looked at the library, the books organized now, the shelves cataloged, the curtains open, the light coming in, the house breathing. You gave this place a heart, he said. I didn't know it didn't have one until you came. Clara leaned her head against his arm. Every house has a heart, she said. It just needs someone to find it. He kissed her hair. Outside, the summer day continued. A bee somewhere near the roses, the sound of the river in the valley, the particular golden quality of a July afternoon in the north of England. The letter, he said quietly. Does Bassett know yet? I wrote to him this morning. And your family? I wrote to my mother yesterday. She will be very pleased. Papa too, once she explains the financial implications to him. Clara smiled. Isabel is coming to visit in September. She wrote to ask if it was convenient. Is it? I told her it was always convenient. She paused. She seems lighter in her letters. Different. People can change, Edmund said, echoing her own words back to her with the precision of a man who catalogues things too, in his own way. They can, Clara agreed. They sat together in the library, in the summer light, with the report on the table and the roses outside the window and the entire vast quiet estate around them, breathing, living, held. Clara thought about the girl she had been a year ago, sitting in a frozen garden in November with tears on her face, reading a book and trying not to be a bother to anyone. Invisible, certain that her role in the world was to be useful, and that was all. She thought about what it had cost her to say yes to a stranger's outstretched hand. She thought about everything that yes had contained, the long carriage ride north, the cold castle, the library and the ledgers and the drainage survey, and all the cups of tea, and all the midnight conversations, and all the moments she had watched him learn to smile. She thought it was possibly the most worthwhile thing she had ever done. He wasn't lucky, she had said, once, in the epilogue of another version of this story. He was just paying attention. What she had not said, what she knew now, looking out at the summer garden with her husband's arm around her, was that she had been paying attention too, every day. To every small thing he did, every careful kindness, every word chosen with such deliberate honesty, two people paying attention to each other. That, she thought, was what love actually was. Not the thunderstroke, not the fever, not the grand gesture in a ballroom, though that had been rather wonderful. Just two people, in a library, in the summer light, making sure the other one was there, making sure the other one knew they were seen. That's the end of our story today. And I genuinely hope, that it gave you something. A little warmth, a little comfort, the feeling that being quiet and good and real is enough. More than enough. Clara didn't fight for the spotlight. She didn't change herself to be seen. She simply showed up, exactly as she was, and waited for someone wise enough to look. I think there is a Clara in all of us. If this story moved you, please, like this video. It tells me that you're here, that this landed, and it helps more people find their way to stories like this one. Leave me a comment. Tell me your favorite moment. Was it the garden scene? The study at midnight? The waltz? The bread? It's always the bread, isn't it? I read every single one, and I respond as often as I can. Your words keep this channel alive, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Right now, before the next video starts. I have so many stories waiting for you. Long ones, slow ones, the kind that take their time and break your heart in the best possible way. Subscribe, like, comment, and I will see you in the next story. Until then, take care of yourself. And remember, someone is paying attention.